state legislature is honestly the greatest privilege that a citizen can have, especially that you allow me to come from out of state. I am the president of Convention of States Action, the organization that is pushing this Article 5 convention movement nationally. I've had the privilege of testifying in roughly 40 state legislatures across the country. And when I say privilege, I want to explain to you why I feel it is such a privilege to do this. It's because the founders imbued you with a unique power. Most state legislatures are not aware of this because when you come in and you do your orientation, they show you where the bathrooms are in the kitchen and the chambers and tell you what all your privileges are. They don't tell you about your power in our federal system of governance. And you have a unique power and a unique responsibility that goes with that power. You have the power to call a convention, to propose amendments, and to ratify those amendments. There is no other person of power in the federal government system that has an equivalent power. The president does not have that power. Congress does not have that power. And though the courts sometimes usurp that power, they were certainly not given that power by our Constitution or by the founders. So I think that puts you in a unique position. And the founders, I believe, knew what they were doing when they put you in that position. Why did they put state legislators in that position? Because mostly they were state legislators or county councilmen, city council members. They believed in and were completely attached to the idea of governance closest to the people is the best sort of governance. I can tell you in my personal experience, having traveled all over the country, some of the very best people I've met in America are sitting in state legislatures today. And so when we look at what we see on TV and the craziness we see in Washington, D.C., I don't think that's representative of the broader system of American governance as the founders intended it, because I see the statesmanship that takes place in the state legislature. So I just want to thank you for your service, and that's why I consider this such a great privilege. I want to address a couple of things that come up regularly about the convention process. And I want to go back in history first. And you will hear people probably today testify that in 1787, America experienced a runaway constitutional convention, that the men who were sent, those great founders that we know, Madison and Adams and Washington, were sent with the sole purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation, that they ignored that mandate from their states and from their state legislatures. They breached what they considered a very high duty of honor to those state legislatures. They behaved in a way that none of us believe any of those founders would have ever behaved, disregarding their instructions, ran away in a convention and drafted an entirely new constitution. And this is the narrative, by the way, that the opponents on both sides, left and right, will tell you about the founders. In fact, it's nonsense. If you do as I've done, if you pull the commissions of each one of those commissioners to the convention, what you will find is 7 of 9 of the commissioners carried written commissions with them that contained the following language. The commissioner shall have any and all authority necessary to render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies of the union. Any and all. All authority necessary. No mention of the Articles of Confederation. Now, indeed, after 7 states had agreed to participate in the convention, Congress made a recommendation, in their own word, and made a recommendation that the states get together to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Important to note, for scholars in the area, that the Articles of Confederation have absolutely no reference to Congress having any authority to call any convention whatsoever to propose amendments to the Articles. So this idea that 1787 was a runaway convention is both an insult to the founders, men of great honor and integrity, and is simply plainly untrue. Today we operate under this great United States Constitution, under Article 5 of that Constitution, and any convention called operates under the auspices of the existing United States Constitution. The only thing that can be discussed at convention are the things that are proposed by you in your resolution that you're considering today, and the other states that propose substantially identical resolutions across the country. It takes 34, you've discussed that, that's a high bar. So that's what it takes to get into convention. This idea of a runaway convention in and of itself is completely absurd, not only historically, but in a practical sense today. You have absolute authority over the delegates you send to convention, as does every other state in the nation. The majority of states will control their delegates at that convention. You will be watching, I presume. Nobody will be ignoring what goes on at that convention. In fact, I would argue it will be the greatest political event in American history since the founding. 250 million people will be watching the country debate what I think is the most important issue in America today. The most important issue facing America today is not whether or not we have a budget. It's not whether or not we have Obamacare. It's not even the immigration debate or the tax debate. The most important debate facing Americans today is a simple 2-word question. Who decides? Who decides? I can tell you And Representative Taylor gave you the statistics. 84% of Americans are sick and tired of Congress deciding for them. Polling shows us that above 70% of Americans across party lines say that the federal government is too much and is involved in too much. It is not a partisan issue. People in South Carolina trust you far more than they trust Congress. And the fight we're having today over this resolution is the simple question: will South Carolina stand and say to the federal government, we're going to get in convention and have a conversation about who decides in America, or will you stay away from that table? That's the question that really faces us today. We've done polling in your state. Over 2/3 of the people in your state in a large statistical poll say that they're in favor of calling this convention. So the question is, do we do what our constituents ask us to do, or do we decide on our own that this is a bad idea? Will we act with courage and stand as the founders intended us to, or will we walk away from the table saying that we do not have the wherewithal or the intelligence or the honor to stand in the way that the founders intended us to stand? How Article 5 got into the Constitution, this second clause, is instructive for us. And it speaks directly to you as state legislators. That's why I think it's so important. With 2 days left in the convention, September 15, 1787, Colonel George Mason stood to address the men assembled. Remember, the convention's almost over. They've been there for months. And he says this to the assembly. He says, we've made a tragic mistake. We have given Congress the power to propose amendments should they deem them necessary, but we failed to give the same power to the states, to the people acting through their state legislators. And then he asked the question, which I think resonates across these 230 years. He asked, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Now, I imagine they laughed when he asked that question. I wish we had video. We could pretty much tell they laughed, because this is what Madison's notes say on the matter. Madison's notes are very thorough and complete. They say 2 words in Latin, nin com. Those words mean no comment or no debate. I challenge you to find many other places in the convention notes where Madison's notes reflect no debate. They debated everything. But on this measure, they were unanimously agreed. Eldridge Gary introduced the second clause of Article 5, giving you, the state legislators, this enormous power, and it was unanimously adopted as part of the United States Constitution. So we know why the founders put it in. They put it in for a time that they believed would come, where the federal government would become a tyranny and would no longer be responsive to the people. And that day has come now. It's come here to the South Carolina legislature. This resolution was first filed in December of 2013, almost 5 years ago. And for 5 years, we have not yet seen a vote in the legislature. And I can tell you from traveling all over the country, from traveling around South Carolina, having been here many times, the people in South Carolina are ready for, and they believe they deserve a vote on this measure. And with that, I'll close my testimony. I'd be happy to stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Meckler, thank you for your testimony, and thank you for what you do. It's very inspiring to hear about your travels. It's very inspiring to hear about what you do on a day-to-day basis. So thank you for that, and thank you for the commitment that you've given to testifying in 40 different state legislatures.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You've hit on a lot of good points, and we want to make sure that you know, you're very welcome here, and we very much appreciate the time you spent with us. I've talked to Mr. Taylor at length about you and your work, and you know, you're very well thought of here in South Carolina, so thank you for that. And I hope that your next trip, wherever you go next, they treat you just as kindly as we do as well. Questions for Mr. Meckler? We can't let you ask a question. I'm sorry, Mr. Magson. Ms. Mandy Powers-Norrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Meckler, thank you so much for being here. I have talked to some people about this, and I think this is the same one. I've talked to people about another Article 5 convention that would involve reversing Citizens United and taking money out of politics, which sounds great. But when I talked to them or the folks with yours, I can't remember which one, they said this one would be limited to 3 very specific charges. And you were speaking fast, and I apologize if I missed those 3 very specific charges. Can you tell me what they are?
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, Representative, thank you for that question. The 3 specific subject matter areas covered by this resolution. The first area is anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. The second, that is anything that would impose scope and jurisdictional restraints on the federal government. And the third is anything that would impose term limits on federal officials. Those are the three subject matter areas. Quick sort of ideas of what those mean. Fiscal restraints would include things like a balanced budget amendment. I think without something like tax and spending caps, that could be very dangerous. We want to prevent the federal government from imposing unfunded mandates on South Carolinians as well. Those would fall under the fiscal reservation section. The second, anything that would impose scope and jurisdiction restrictions. These would be things to get the federal government out of South Carolinians' business. For example, I believe in South Carolina, y'all do a very good job of running your own education system. You do not need Washington, D.C. telling you how to do that. And so that would fall within the central tenet. And the last is term limits for members of Congress, but also for the federal judiciary, as discussed by Representative Taylor when he was up here. And importantly, in my opinion, federal bureaucrats as well.
That sounds so broad to me. Is there anything limiting that? Because it seems like just about anything could fall under those three tenets.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, with all due respect, it is actually quite limited because in each of those subject matter areas, the only things that can be discussed are things that would limit federal government power. And that was the intentional way that this was drafted. It is to allow the states to once again restore some level of enumerated powers limitation on the federal government. Over the last 115 years, the federal government, through the federal courts, and specifically the Supreme Court, has largely erased the limited enumerated powers of the Constitution and given the federal government broad swaths of power over things that are supposed to remain in state purview. So it is limited to limiting federal government power.
Yes. Thank you. Now, could the Citizens United people and their tenet be combined with these three? Or is it too late to do that because other states have already passed this one with just these three?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, they are not combinable, and the reason is Citizens United would actually expand federal government power to regulate election spending. So the Citizens United case was designed as a free speech case to get the federal government out of political speech, and so to overturn Citizens United would actually expand federal government power.
Thank you.
Mr. Meckler, briefly, how many states have passed this very resolution, this same resolution?
To date, 12 states have passed the resolution, Mr. Chairman.
How many are needed for a constitutional convention?
34 are needed, Mr. Chairman, so 22 to go. Roughly 18 legislatures have pending legislation.
And this is different from, I mean, we've seen constitutional conventions, BBAs, specifically just BBAs, right? And I know, again, do they meet the same criteria? 34 states have to pass that specific resolution in order to hold the convention.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. You're discussing the legal concept of what's called aggregation. The applications must be identical or substantially identical enough so that they aggregate to the requisite 34.
Now, my next question, let's say an amendment happens on a resolution in North Carolina, does that throw the whole game off?
Depends on the amendment. If it is substantive to the amendment, yes, it would throw the aggregation off, and that particular resolution would not be counted.
Who determines if it's substantive?
Generally speaking, if the operative language, you'll see there are three sections of operative language. I described those as the three limitations. If those are the same or virtually identical, then they will aggregate. And that determination is actually going to be made, in my opinion, by the states.
Okay.
What it says in the Constitution is Congress shall call the convention. That is what is described in legal terms as a ministerial or administrative duty. The states retain the sovereign authority to call the convention on their own if Congress will not do it.
So if one of those three are struck, for instance, that would be deemed a substantive change that would not count towards that tally to get to 34, correct?
It's generally correct. I would like to give you one legal exception to that. If a particular state legislature were to state that it was their intent to aggregate with other applications, then that statement of intention is what will actually carry the day on aggregation.
Do you know if the question or challenge would be heard in a state court or a federal district court?
Generally speaking, that would be a federal court question. Federal courts have weighed in on Article 5 approximately 40 times, and generally speaking, their answer is that they choose not to weigh in. They call it a political question in federal court parlance.
Okay, and again, so I'm clear, 12 states have passed this very language right here.
That is correct.
Thank you, sir. Any further questions from Mr. Meckler? I see none. Mr. Meckler, thank you for your time and thank you for your travels. We appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you,
to hear from
committee members.